Thanks again, Lab Miami, Endeavor, and of course all our contributors, such as the Knight Foundation, for sponsoring events like this here in Miami and trying to build what we'd like to have a true tech ecosystem. So we're in build mode, as I like to call it. My name is Andrew Corey, and I'm the founder of a company called Journey. We're an online platform where we connect freelance writers and journalists with marketing agencies and new content for them, so on-demand content writing. I also run a summit annually called the Urbanism Summit. So if you go to urbanismsummit.com, you'll learn a little bit more about that. I'm trying to foster more collaboration between the different industries that are responsible for building better cities. I think that we can strive when we collaborate more. So that's sort of a mission of ours. So tonight we're here to hear from the man himself, David Koretz with Plum Wine, and just like to welcome you with a round of applause. Hopefully, yeah.
Thank you.
So David, before we jump into you telling us a little bit about yourself, I heard that Jesus turned water into wine. Apparently, you're trying to keep it fresh for everyone to drink. That's great. So tell us a little about your journey, who you are, where you came from. Did you start here in Miami? How did you end up here?
Yeah, so I started my first company when I was 14. I was about to go into my freshman year of high school, and I was really fixated on this concept called home automation, which was the idea that you could control your lights and appliances from your phone, now obviously from your smartphone. But back then it was literally from your phone. Press 2 to turn on your kitchen lights. And at the time it was all wired. And when I was 14, I was really fixated on this idea that we could create the first wireless system. And so at 14, I started this company, and it grew way faster than I was able to run it. So the first year we did $274,000 in revenue. We made about $13,000, which felt like all the money in the world. I grew up in Rochester, New York, as a very middle-class kid in public school. And so the next year we did $2.4 million in revenue. And I was just hanging on. And I was going to high school during the day. I was going to college full-time at night. And I was trying to grow and run this company in between. And the year after that, we did 10x that growth. And I ended up graduating a year early from high school and been running companies ever since. So technically, I'm a dropout. I went to all the universities in the area. And I said, I'd love to join you. And all of them said, we can't have somebody who doesn't have a high school diploma. So they all turned me down. And then finally, RIT accepted me as a 14-year-old. So that's who I went to.
I mean, that's great. So they turned you down because you just didn't have a diploma. Did they look at your bank account?
They didn't, but years later, like the revenge I got was the University of Rochester. I really wanted to go to the Simon School, which is an MBA program at University of Rochester. And they didn't just reject me, they aggressively rejected me. And like maybe 10 years later, I got this call, and it was from the dean of the Simon School, and he said, we're really interested in having you join our board of directors to help guide the university. And so they wouldn't accept me as a student, but a board member was okay.
Right.
So
obviously you're a serial entrepreneur by definition, so you've seen a lot in your journey. And I'm quite interested to find out, how do you define success along the way? What does that look like for you? Are you successful now?
So I mean, for me, it's interesting. I am built in a paranoid style. So I was just talking to the guys from Voihoy, and they were saying congrats on your round, and I always cringe when people congratulate me on raising money, because in my head, like, all that happened is the expectations went up, the bar went up, the pressure went up, and the expectations for success went up. And so am I successful? No, not in this current company. I think we have a lot more to prove. And I think the biggest mistake and the biggest error that's happened in the last 10 years is that people started to measure success by venture capital. And I think success should be measured by outcome, not by raising money.
Yeah, I mean, we always sort of like to tout, hey, 10 million here, almost $1 billion here. I mean, we talk about Magic Leap locally. But as you say, it's like, where's the product? Where are you making money? And those are all metrics, right? That are still, in any business, that's the outcome you want. But aside from that, I mean, in your previous companies and just in your life journey as an entrepreneur, you had great success from a very early age. How many failures have you had along the way compared to the successes?
So a buddy of mine, this guy named Scott Weiss, who founded a company called Ironport that he sold for just under $1 billion, had a great line, and I think it's totally true. I think the right pronunciation is whiffy. But the expression that he said is that every great company he's ever been involved with has had at least 2 whiffy moments in their history. And Wi-Fi is, we're all friends here, we're fucked, it's over. And I think that's true. I don't think you build greatness without having that ugly wall that you're staring in front of. And people sort of glamorize the entrepreneurial journey, but like it's running into a lot of walls, and usually like brick walls head on until either one kills you or you finally break through it. And I think that's what it is. So I think we'll measure the success of Plum after we're done, not until then.
So it's not the only time I know as an entrepreneur whether or not I should give up is either when I'm hit a wall or when I'm actually dead. Is that essentially what you're saying?
No, actually,
water.
No, because the problem is sometimes you're right? Sometimes you're not dead, but you should be. And so I think the hardest thing, my lesson is, I started a company back when I was 19. It was a software as a service company, and it was the first competitor to Microsoft Exchange. It was a SaaS company in days when no one knew what the hell SaaS was. People just said you're a .com because they didn't know what else to call us. And so I was running this company and it grew. We had 250,000 people on the platform, 250,000 companies on the platform, 3 million users, generating millions of dollars in revenue. And the truth is I should have left 5 years before I did. Because what had happened is Google came in and was offering Google Apps for free at the time. That forced Microsoft to drop their pricing on Microsoft Outlook and Exchange. And I effectively was caught in a price war between Google on one side and Microsoft on the other. And the idea that we were going to sort of survive and win there was insanity. Like, I should have known better, and I stayed too long. So I actually think sometimes knowing when to call the fight is actually pretty important.
Now, with regards to Plum and the technology, how did you even decide that you wanted to go down this route? Wine, dispensary.
So,
and then building tech for it.
I feel like every company I've ever built, people are like, why the hell are you the guy to do this? And that's probably true. My most recent company was a cybersecurity company. I built a company called Mykonos Software that I started in 2010, and we sold it for $100 million 2 years later. And it was a company that stopped hackers from breaking into banks and governments. And it was actually very similar to the wine business in one sense, which is every great business is born out of sort of an intense pain. And for us, it was Russian and Chinese hackers constantly trying to attack our company and trying to defend against it and feeling like every tool we bought didn't work. And so we built this product that worked. And so eventually I sold it to Juniper Networks. I worked there for a few years, found out I'm a really horrible employee, and ended up starting a company called Plum. And for me, it was the same pain. What I was feeling, I was living up in Napa Valley, and I was finding that more often than not, if my fiance was traveling and I was by myself, I'd open a bottle of wine and the next day sort of painfully pour half of $100 bottle down the drain.
You mean down this in one sitting? I mean, come on.
So I've had those nights too,
okay.
Right? And I think that's the problem, right? Everybody who loves wine has had the same 3 moments. That night where you're like, you know what? I'm just going to have one more glass because I don't want to waste this really expensive wine, right? And I see a lot of heads nodding, like everyone's had that extra glass, right? And just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? And so, not judging. We've all had those nights where it might be necessary. But no, I think for me it was a function of I got frustrated pouring wine down the drain. And the other thing that was happening is I spend probably 200 nights a year in hotel rooms. I travel a lot for work. I ran a global business at Juniper. And I don't care what hotel you stay in, the wine sucks in your room, right? Nobody's ever had a great glass of wine by getting on their hands and knees and rifling through that dorm room fridge and for a plastic screw cap of wine that's like somehow $50. So I think that experience sucks, and I think every great company starts with an experience that really sucks. And I think it has to sort of annoy you and grate at you until you feel the energy to go do it and put the work into it.
But some could say, well, it's such a luxury space. I mean, you're not solving anything that's going to save humanity anytime soon. So it always begs the question, right? Whenever you talk to investors and people asking, well, what problem are you solving in consumer sector or B2B, whatever? How did you justify really truly going? Is it truly because you just did not want to waste your half bottle of wine?
Well, let's take a step back. This notion that every Silicon Valley company or every startup is like curing cancer is not true. Like there's a whole lot of useless selfie apps out there for kids to send naked photos. Like, let's not pretend it's all world changing. I don't think that's the right bar, right? I think the world gets better when people sort of look at things that aren't good and decide that they're sort of not happy with it, and they decide they're going to push. I think this is a luxury business, but not in the sense you're thinking. It's luxury in the sense that when you sell a company for $100 million, you have the luxury to get to pick what you do next. And that was the true luxury. This is a business I really believed in and really wanted to build. And I don't think anyone would have trusted me to build it had I not had the previous exit. So, I mean, to me, like, the real value of an exit is what do you get to do after that? So
it's like you direct a really good movie and you get to ask for a lot more money in the next project, right?
But it's not money, right? It's like the one for me, one for them. I think acting's the right parallel, because think about any great actor. There's that old saying in the movie business, one's for them, one for me. And I think if you do a great, incredible film, you have the now sort of the firepower and latitude to go build something that's maybe a little artsy, maybe not going to be commercially successful, but it's going to be amazing.
Now take us a little behind the tech, if you may, of Plum itself. Is there AI involved? Is it IoT essentially? Is it a true IoT machine?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's always AI in everything now, but there is. So the way Plum works is you drop in any 2 bottles of wine, and there are cameras built into each cathedral that photograph the label, push it up to the cloud. We do algorithmic image matching, so we compare it against a database of tens of millions of different wines and automatically identify vintage, varietal, region, winery, and wine. We then chill it automatically to the perfect serving temperature, and then we take a motorized needle that spins on a drive shaft at 140 RPM, goes right through the metal foil, right through the cork or metal screw cap, pressurize the bottle with argon gas, which is inert, sucks it out 1 glass at a time.
Wonderful. Did you get that? I was waiting for you to tell me that somehow it was on the blockchain as well.
That's where I draw the line.
Oh, that's where you draw the line. Okay. So, I mean, that's fascinating, right? So you have this amazing technology. It's hardware, though. I mean, you think about jumping into a business like this, and you're saying you have the luxury as someone who's had an exit or a few to kind of build what you want, right? One for you. But it's hardware. And when you talk about scalability, I mean, is it something that you would even attempt if this was your first go at it? Doing something like this?
Well, because I've
gone... How do you scale as well,
Well, so every business I've done has been in a different market, so I've always had that learning curve every time I've done it. This is incredibly hard to build. It's a very sophisticated product. It's very complex. But it was really hard to stop incredibly bright hackers from breaking into banks and governments. Like, that wasn't easy. It's just a different type of hard. I think for most of the companies I've been in, I would have never started them if I had any idea how hard they would have to do. And this is probably true. Like, this is one of those businesses that incredibly hard. But I think the one thing that's probably worth mentioning is that it's not that it's one for me, but my investors said, enjoy yourself, like, don't worry about the economics, they expect a return, so the market had to be there. Just sort of as a rough numbers, there's about 7 million hotel rooms Plum can go into. It pays for itself at 1 glass of wine per week, and it turns out that the economics are we can sell it for about $2,000 a room. So there's a $14 billion opportunity. It wasn't just like the gratitude of their heart that caused them to invest, right? I think they felt there was a business.
Yeah, I've never met an investor that gives you money for free. So, see, the tech, yes, we spoke about that, and you spoke briefly about, of course, investors. You raised here locally. What's the name of the Las Olas, right? Mm-hmm. Were they the exclusive?
No, so we did our seed round back in 2015. So before we took any money, I put $500,000 of my own money in. And it was my way of sort of, one, making my own bet on the company, and two, probably just as importantly, before I took anyone else's money, I wanted to make sure I was going to spend their money wisely, and I felt like the best way to do that was to spend my own. So I put my own money in first. We then raised a $4 million seed round from a company called Coastal Ventures. A lot of you may recognize the name. It's a $3 billion fund out of Silicon Valley. And in that last round, we had met these guys that were out of Fort Lauderdale. Everyone asked us why we liked them so much. And for us, what was compelling is they were operators. And for everyone in the room who's trying to start a business, there's nothing more infuriating than trying to deal with a set of investors that have never run a company themselves, because they have no context, right? And the advice they give you is sort of often irrelevant. And so we met this guy who was the founder of a company that he was able to, called Hire One, that he was able to take public on the New York Stock Exchange. And so we felt like we wanted to build a public company. So having a guy that had done that was amazing.
So you raised here, Fort Lauderdale. I just want you to give me a little bit of your take, because you've been in Miami for how long now?
About 3 years.
3 years, and you moved from where?
Silicon Valley.
What was I talking about? So what is your take on what's trying to be built here, what you've encountered? I know you're very, very much, you don't mince words, but what do you think about Miami as an ecosystem right now, where we're trying to go?
I think it's incredibly too high on the full of shit scale.
You heard that, too high on the full of shit scale.
Like it's dangerous, right? So, and for anyone in this room that's trying to do the really hard work of building a company, it should terrify you, because the issue that you get when you get this sort of overhyped ecosystem, which Miami is great at hyping things. So like on the positive, I've never seen a city do it better. If you compare it relative to actual progress, by that measure, we're the best ecosystem there is. But I think the problem is investors have a very short attention span, and probably even a shorter patience level. And so if they start putting money into these local companies and the companies don't produce outcomes, I think it's going to be incredibly hard for the next generation. Like that could kill an ecosystem for a decade. So I guess like my personal bias, I don't go to anything. So I skip every one of these yoga breakfasts and all these random things that I get invited to. I think it's important people sort of understand that building a startup is not glamorous. It's not that much fun. It's incredibly hard, and you only do it because you sort of believe that you have to. And I think I just would love to see Miami sort of dial back the self-congratulatory style and sort of get into the hard work that I think it takes.
So, I mean, what would be your pitch to anyone who's trying to come here, trying to believe in the system and say, build it? Because everyone has to start from somewhere. Silicon Valley didn't become Silicon Valley on day one. So how do we get there? I mean, what's your prescription? Yeah,
it's a great question, and it's true. You have to start somewhere. But if you look at ecosystems, certain ones sort of have this natural momentum behind them, and others sort of fall apart. So think Boston in the 90s and 2000s when they were trying to be that 128 loop, and it was supposed to be the next Silicon Valley, right? And we've all probably heard the next Silicon Valley story for 20 years, and last time I checked, there's still one of them.
Yeah.
So I think part of it is, I think there are three things that this ecosystem needs to really win long term. Probably the most important is you need world-class engineers. And I think that's true for sort of narrow swaths of the market. Like it's true in medical devices. You've got obviously the Mako guys and Stryker, and there's been some great work here. Modernizing Medicine's done amazing. I think you've got a little bit in hardware. So the reason we're here in large part is because there was a pocket of engineers from Motorola that were sitting in South Florida producing world-class phones for several decades. And that's why Magic Leap is here, and that's why we're here. And I think that's a pocket of real talent. But I think ultimately, if you sort of subscribe to the Mark Andreessen software's eating the world theory, it's always going to be about software. And I think Miami will not survive and thrive until it builds world-class software.
So you speak to, of course, we were good at hype, and which lends itself to an entertainment industry that is thriving here. The culinary scene has certainly come a long way. Tourism is still very big. Logistics, we're really good at fraud, so that's also an industry of its own. I mean, how do we tackle all these things? I mean, can we own one of these categories and go for it? We're definitely not Napa, so Plum doesn't even register as far as like an industry here. You know what I mean? And
yeah. Well, I mean,
wine, I should say.
It's funny on the fraud side. I don't know why I'm going to take that to answer, but
okay, cool.
It's really funny though, because when I first moved here, I was introduced to this guy repeatedly. People kept wanting to connect me with this guy, and what they said is this guy cut the first check into Google. And what sort of caught me so off guard by it is at the time I just moved from Silicon Valley, still had a house in Napa. And I was traveling back and forth. And I was on the board with a brilliant guy named Andy Bechtolsheim, who founded Sun Microsystems, more recently founded Arista, probably the only guy to build multiple billion-dollar companies. And he had a story that was shockingly similar to the one I kept hearing in Miami, which is he cut the first check into Google. Except with one really strange part to the story. The guy in Miami cut the check 2 years before Andy. And that sounded odd to me. So it turns out, fast forward, and I think he's now in Malta. He's somewhere avoiding extradition. So I think, we need a healthy skepticism in the ecosystem. But I think there's no reason, so why do people come to Miami and why build here? I think there are great reasons. One of them is tax, right? So, for entrepreneurs, you guys have sort of the worst asymmetry between good years and bad years, right? And so when I started Plum, I took $1 salary per year for 2 years. So those were low on the overall income front. But when you have an exit, you have this massive return. And one of the things that makes certain high-tax states so painful is that asymmetry. Because all of a sudden, you're paying 13.9% California state tax on your big exit year. And so I think tax is a major factor, especially for second-time entrepreneurs who went through the pain of cutting that tax check to California or to New York. So I think that's one that people downplay, but I think it's real. I also think that there's probably a second one, which is cost structure here is lower. And so I think you can go a lot further with the same dollars. So I think Miami has huge advantages. I think we just don't necessarily leverage them the way we should.
Yeah, the cost structure obviously is lower here based upon where you're coming from. There's a lot of income inequality here, and a lot of shit that we're still dealing with. But that being said, talk about exits. A thriving ecosystem for any tech community is that you exit and you stay there, reinvest. Plum has an exit. Are you sticking around? Will you reinvest here? Will you find those gems and support them?
I guess I would caveat that I don't think the CEO is the one that matters. So the concept you're describing, and it's a really important one, is called a mushroom cloud. Microsoft was the cause of a mushroom cloud in Seattle in the 70s, 80s as they went public and built the scale. And what it did is it created hundreds and now thousands of millionaires and multimillionaires that then built another wave of tech companies, right? Having a lot of wealth and people that have seen huge success drives the next generation. Seattle had it, obviously Silicon Valley has had it many, many times. Even Austin had it with Dell, and then more recently with companies like Trilogy. So I think the point of a mushroom cloud won't be me. It'll be, does Plum give an equity plan that lets a lot of our employee base make money? And I think that's frankly far more important, because I think it's less and less likely that the CEO starts something and more likely that the senior leadership team does. And so honestly, the way I'll measure our success is on three things. Like, one, do we find a path to a great outcome? Two, probably more importantly, do my employees go become CEOs? So I always measure my success, and I told people when I first joined Juniper, I was going to measure my success as running products by how many CEOs got created in my tenure. And one of the coolest things was after I left Juniper, getting these emails from guys saying, I quit, and I'm going to do my own thing. And I think that's what I want to see. So my view of a mushroom cloud is, I don't know if we'll be the biggest one, but I think, yeah, we can have an impact on the community.
That's great. So, going personal, obviously I met your fiance earlier, Elizabeth. Let's dive into the personal side of things and how startup life, entrepreneurial life affects your, just everything from health, you start talking about traveling a lot, mindfulness, consciousness about who you are, the relationships that you build or the bridges you burn along the way. How do you navigate that as a person when you have those nights by yourself in a hotel room and you're like, shit, what am I doing with my life? Is this really life?
Yeah.
Is this really living?
So the best part of this is sitting next to my fiance is her trainer. So everything I say is going to be used against me.
I didn't mean to set you up, but it's all good.
No, it's a great question. I think part of it is, it helps for me. My fiance is a senior VP at a tech company in media, so she has a similar lifestyle. So I think it helps when sort of people are aligned on the same lifestyle. But I think when I talk to entrepreneurs, a lot of the what we talk about is how do you make sure that the thing you're doing is sort of deep-seated enough in your gut that you want to do it or need to do it, that when it gets really hard, you sort of survive? Because you will have those moments where the job sucks. And you will have those moments where it's just not that pleasant. Like being a CEO is a pretty lonely job. For all of you that have tried it, it's pretty intense. And so, for me, I think doing something that I care about in a space I'm interested in makes a huge difference. And then second is, I'm driven by the fact that I'd love to see wealth creation, not at my level, but at my senior team and the overall team. So, there are things that drive me, but I don't think it's really work-life balance.
Okay.
I'm also I should say, I'm really shitty at work-life balance. That's not a skill of mine.
I don't think has anyone figured out a formula for work-life balance in here? Have you guys all figured it out yet? Okay, so I don't think anyone in the room has figured that out. So yeah, it's a myth. So obviously, we are here in Miami. We're building amazing things here. I think real estate still remains a very big play. How do you get more investors to actually step out of the realm that they know and become a little more comfortable with trying to bet on tech? Because I think we always every year tout the Kaufman report about Miami being the most entrepreneurial city, which great. Miami Herald publishes that. No offense to you, Nancy, but it's just something that doesn't really speak to the actual true startup ecosystem. That's just people. It could be a shell corporation people in set up a LLC for a condo down in freaking Brickell. It shouldn't count. But how do we actually parse that and get investors to actually step out and be a little more comfortable with taking a bet on tech?
I think there are two sides to it. So remember that, and by the way, we love Miami. It's been an amazing experience being here. And I think part of what we love is it has a very Wild West feel to it, right? And it feels raw. There are no rules that I've ever found that exist in Miami. I just remember when my friends have come visit me and we're doing 80 passing the sheriffs on 95 when we don't get pulled over. All my Silicon Valley friends just are stunned. I think part of it is you got to remember this is really new money. And I don't mean new money in the sense that generationally, but rather it's new to US money largely. A lot of the money in Miami is foreign capital. And the first generation of foreign capital is going to be like every first generation immigrant on the planet. It's going to be very cautious, very risk averse. It's going to have a huge tendency to go to real assets. So it makes a ton of sense to me that real estate is where Miami's first generation will put their wealth, right? I don't think that's how their kids that grow up in Miami will think about the world. So I think a lot of this gets solved as you shift out one generation. And then the second thing is, I think you've got to have exits. Exits sort of get everybody comfortable. Once somebody sees their friend make a lot of money, as powerful a factor as sort of greed is, that FOMO, that fear of missing out when your buddy invested in Uber and you didn't, people have that. That's real. Everybody I know in Silicon Valley has a story of the company they should have put money in and didn't. And it stings. And especially when your friends start talking more and more about it. I think in every one of the big companies, whether it's Google, Facebook, I have a friend who just made $100 million or something on a 10K check. And the reason I know that is because they tell me. And the reason they tell me is because people like to talk about that stuff. So I think those exits will help.
Great, so having exits, which is great. Obviously, it just kind of gives us, I think, just to look at the trajectory of how far away we are truly from getting to that place where we're a solid ecosystem. But in the meantime, what can we do to really ignite that? I don't want to wait for another generation to come around to make something happen. What can we do right now to educate or perhaps nudge a few of these folks?
So, yeah.
Before the exits.
Sorry, and I guess that waiting a generation is sort of a depressing answer to
a
room full of people trying to raise money. So I think a few things, right? One, you're going to have to exit. Although exits is sort of not a great answer, it's the real answer. Nothing will have sort of quite the effect on the ecosystem as a bunch of exits. So our friend Ryan, who just sold Chewy, that's a great exit for South Florida, and hopefully that money gets put back to work. So I think there are people here that are doing impressive things, and I think those exits will happen. Modernizing Medicine is a $100+ million revenue company. Like, they're going to have, I would expect, a 10-figure exit, and I think they'll make a lot of millionaires locally, and I think that's amazing. So I think exits is probably most important. Shorter term, I'd like to see more state and local money funding comp sci programs in the local universities to solve that computer science problem. You cannot have a Silicon Valley that does not have software engineers. And our software engineering talent in Miami is woefully inadequate relative to the size that the ecosystem aspires to be.
We can also argue that if we do graduate all these comp sci folks, we're still looking at the cost of developing here versus, say, going down to Latin America, South America, and all these other places where a lot of agencies do, and people are going to look for the best bang for their buck and talent. They're just going to compete.
Not really. Yeah. So we don't offshore anything. In fact, go to Google and ask how many comp sci folks they're hiring initially out of South America, out of Asia. People try to do that, and I've built Russian development teams. I've had labs in Asia. It's really hard to do. It's way harder to do than people think. It's really easy to screw up. It's really easy to lose money. I think the most important thing at a startup is having the people in the room running at those brick walls together, right? It makes it more palatable as you're doing it. And the only way you do that is when they're employees and they get stock and they're vested with the same goals you have. And so I think from my view, I don't think there's any substitute for that. I personally would never advocate to have a startup send engineering talent to South America. I think that's insanity.
So, solopreneur versus an entrepreneur who has a co-founder. Obviously, from the sound of it, it's easier bet, right? It's the co-founded team. But can a solopreneur actually make it? And do you see good examples of that? Someone in that, just going it alone.
I don't know if I count as a good example, but I've been a sole entrepreneur my whole career.
Okay.
Probably does not play well with others, right? So probably by just just by no choice. No, I think what it comes down to is how well you actually sort of are self-aware. And when I was a 19-year-old entrepreneur and building companies, I didn't have the self-awareness to figure out how to hire the team around me that was going to be better than me at the things I wasn't good at. And I think that's a skill that takes some maturity and takes some time to develop. But as you develop that, I think you can be a sole founder. I think it just takes way more self-awareness, and you have to be sort of a master of none.
Yeah, jack of all trades. So, what's lately sexy? Blockchain, AI, machine learning, all those wonderful things. The buzzwords that get some investors excited. I was just wondering why you didn't jump into that space of ICO when you were going to raise, and again, mention anything about blockchain, putting Plum on the blockchain.
Well,
I think Plum belongs on the blockchain.
I don't. Okay, right. Well, look, ICO is like the classic Miami example of fast, loose money that likely won't end well. I think separate, and I think most people, the problem is, and I thought it was really interesting, this guy that I met when I was early in my 20s, a guy named Naval Ravikant, who started a thing called AngelList that a lot of you will know, really brilliant guy. And his comment was, and I think anyone who's sort of looking at an ICO or investing in Bitcoin should think twice about what he said, which is, his comment was, I'm not qualified. This is Naval Ravikant, founder at August Capital, or one of the partners at August Capital, founder of AngelList, super smart guy in the Valley, and he said, I'm not qualified to invest in blockchain. I don't have the technical skill. Yet every idiot I know is investing in Bitcoin. And so it's hard to sort of reconcile the fact that you've got people that don't understand the technology or sort of barely understand it and are making investments. I think ultimately, if you're taking investors' money, no matter what flavor you put on it, I think you're going to have SEC regulation come in. And the more casual investors lose their money, the uglier it's going to get. And I think it's really naive that Miami sort of has convinced itself that ICOs are the new, easy, fast money. I think it ends poorly.
Yeah. Well, you got to say also, it's not just Miami, because there are people who come here to prey on this vibe,
There are. but like I read a story of I think it was a bunch of Miami kids, and I'll probably screw up, so I'll say allegedly in the beginning. They actually were raising money for an ICO, and one of their co-founders was like this older, gray-haired, sort of distinguished-looking gentleman, which would have been fine, except they found the real guy on LinkedIn, and he's a professor in Canada. And they just took his picture and placed him on the management team page, because I guess he fit the part. So that sounds like fraud to me. I don't know how that doesn't sort of end poorly.
Yeah, it's an industry, unfortunately. So trends, anything coming up that you're excited about, that you see in the space, the IoT, obviously Plum is really great. It's sort of an example where you can build hardware, match in the cloud, and all the other technologies that's behind it. So is there something else that Plum could do, another vertical? Is that even something on your mind right now? Yeah,
there's a bunch. I think taking a step back, there are 3 areas that I think are incredibly interesting for people that have the skill or sort of desire to go into them. One of them is, I think, self-driving cars. And I think, in every major technology shift, people tend to sort of overestimate the impact in the short term and underestimate the long-term implication. If you could save 100,000 lives a year by taking drivers out of the equation, like that's an incredibly powerful technology. So personally, the issue though is a regulatory issue. So if I go out and on the way home, kill somebody, it's my fault. It's not BMW's fault. But if Uber in their self-driving car kills somebody, is it Uber's fault? And think about that for a second, because that'll effectively affect and sort of be the determinant for whether or not self-driving technology ever works, right? If a corporation is liable, then you can never get perfect technology. So no matter how many orders of magnitude better you get, all of a sudden your lawsuits become sort of something to litigate. And I don't think you want a self-driving car to be litigating with Uber on the other side, right? That feels like a scary proposition. So I think that's one thing that people have to sort of figure out the framework. The second one I'm really interested in is how kitchens evolve. So Plum is obviously, it's a connected to IoT device, but I think there's an amazingly interesting opportunity for the evolution of kitchen. And do we one day have a kitchen that understands whether or not the food is fresh, that has the ability to cook itself? And that's another one of those technologies that's sort of useless until it's perfect. But once it gets there, which I think it will, it'll be unbelievably powerful. And the third one, and this is one I am interested in doing myself at Plum, is around coffee. So my old boss is now the CEO at Starbucks. He just replaced Howard Schultz. And what's interesting is, like, if you think about Starbucks experience and then you compare that to your hotel room coffee is as good an experience as hotel room wine, right? There's a coffee pot, there's sort of 3 choices, right? A coffee pot that's never been washed in our lifetimes, right? 2, it's a Keurig or an espresso, which it's fine if you like it, but it's not great. Or 3, you can pay $12 for a pot of coffee plus a $5 delivery charge plus 20%, and like 45 minutes later, a $25 pot of coffee shows up. I think that experience sucks. And I think what I'm super interested in is, what does a hotel room look like if you fast forward 10 years? Because I think the trend that people are underestimating is, you think about a hotel room today, I can walk into a hotel room, bypass the front desk. I can check in the room with my phone and unlock the door. I can sit in that room. I'm never going to pick up the phone and call the front desk. I'm never going to call room service because I can get Uber Eats delivered faster than the hotel's own room service product. I'm not turning on pay-per-view because I now have Hulu and Netflix on my laptop. What is the job of a luxury hotelier in a world where they don't interact with their guest? I think that's a way more profound impact on hotel, which is a very South Florida skill set, than people are understanding. And so to that end, I'm sort of intrigued by the idea of, could we provide a Starbucks quality experience without leaving the hotel room and at the same price as Starbucks? So could you hit a button and get 90% of a Starbucks while still in your underwear? I think that would be an interesting business.
Sounds very fascinating. Except I think all the hotels in the future, they're called Airbnb, aren't they?
Honestly, it's a great... But it's a great point, but the answer, here's the interesting thing, and there's some hoteliers in the audience. Short answer is no. Hoteliers are doing better than they ever have. So ADRs are higher than they ever been. So right now in Silicon Valley, we have hotels that used to be $500 a night that are now touching $1,000 a night. They haven't provided any more service. They haven't changed their product. They haven't hired any more staff.
Shady, isn't it? I mean, come on. You raise your price and you're not doing anything better?
That's called every airline I've ever met. Yeah, it's the business of supply and demand.
Yes, especially in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, in places like Miami Beach in the wintertime, when it's 100% occupancy, rates go up. Yeah. And in places like San Francisco and Silicon Valley, where regulations have sort of stifled new hotel construction and land prices have gone through the roof, it's really hard to build a new hotel there, and prices are going to keep climbing.
So locally, we actually, speaking of just how the future of kitchens could look, we actually have a really amazing botanical garden here that's also a research facility. It's called the Fairchild Garden. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but they have a component where between NASA, a partnership, they're able to figure out how to grow plants in space so that the astronauts can actually grow their own food. And this is being tested right now. And this is being tested with a biotech magnet school, a public school, that's very south in a very sort of like you wouldn't consider underserved neighborhood. So I'm not sure if many of you here in Miami are aware of this garden, first of all, and that this research program is going on. But we have a lot of gems happening in our backyard, and it's interesting that you're speaking to that because, when you talk about machines that can actually grow a particular plant or vegetable or fruit based upon climate, that it's, the data has been, sort of pulled from somewhere else and it's being automated. This is tech that's being developed locally, and I'd be interested in you'd be interested in collaborating with folks like that in your research, because I think working with schools, education is a huge part. It's not just comp sci, right? The biotech is also a big deal in some of these things. So how do you see collaboration between universities, high schools, even going all the way down to the middle schools, elementary, and really getting an ecosystem that's actually focused heavily on tech from a very, very early stage?
So I think, if you look at any ecosystem, STEM funding in middle school and high school is sort of the ultimate determinant of whether or not you get a good college ecosystem. So it's incredibly important. It's hard for startups, in my experience, to collaborate with universities because the pace are so different. So, universities sort of think on multi-year research projects, and startups think about going out of business every 90 days if they don't figure things out. So the cadence between the two is really hard to do. At least in my experience, it's been. I think the most interesting thing will be, can they spin those things out into startups of their own and get the velocity of a startup with, sort of the do-good aspect of being able to fix issues like food.
Gotcha. So we're going to wrap and go to Q&A right now. And if you have any questions, please raise your hands. Raise your hand and ask away.
Hey, David. Actually, I saw you at the Startup City at the Miami World Symphony when you first arrived, and really inspired that you've really grown. And I work with a seafood and wine festival, and in the Miami community, we've had a lot of consumer packaged good for food and beverage that's grown significantly. And my question is, in trying to build Miami as a food innovation hub, compared it to San Fran, New York, Denver, it comes back to what you said, that we have to create a few successes in the food or in food tech. And what would you say to support that critical mass to either fund food companies, to support their growth, or to build that tipping point? What would you say that here specifically, would support food or food tech?
Well, so two things. I think the thing we didn't talk about is a lot of the investment area for VCs comes down to multiples. And what I mean by that is, if you look at traditional hardware companies, they're valued on a multiple of 1 times revenue, 2 times revenue. If you look at software as service companies, they're valued at 7 to 12 times revenue. And so if you're a VC and you're thinking about where to put your money, it's sort of much easier to invest in software companies or soft goods because of the margin profile and because of the return profile. And so I think the most interesting food companies are companies that have figured out how to bridge that gap. So for example, Plum, I guess we're sort of in that food space. We're really a software company if you look behind the scenes. So if you look at our business model, we sell our hardware to the hotels at cost, and we charge them an annual SaaS fee for the software. So our revenue over a 7-year customer life is 75% software and 25% hardware. And if I have my way, eventually I'm going to give the hardware away for free, and I'm going to just charge for the software. So, I think a lot of it is food companies will be more successful to the extent they figure out how to extract revenue from recurring SaaS-style models versus more traditional food models. There's some incredible ones, like there's a company called Impossible Foods in the Valley, which if you guys haven't seen this, it's unbelievably cool. It is a burger that you put on a grill and it sizzles. It looks like a burger, it tastes like a burger, and it's 100% plant-based. And it is indistinguishable. If I didn't tell you were eating plant, you wouldn't know. So I think there is sort of an opportunity in food tech like there hasn't been before. And I think you've got a growing problem where you've got, a middle class in Asia specifically coming online that the ecosystem can't support with current levels of farming. So I think it's going to be really interesting. I think a lot of the food tech will be around drones and how you actually use drones to better understand your crops. So when I was living in Napa, they were just starting to actually do aerial drones that could actually understand the soil via infrared camera and other sensors shooting down and tell farmers things they never understood. They were guessing for decades or hundreds of years, and now they can just know. So I think you start that ecosystem by trying to find businesses that are sort of split the difference. They look like food tech, but they feel like software. And I think those businesses will be more interesting.
Yeah, I think everyone is basically becoming a software tech company and plus the products that they're producing. You had a question back there?
I did, actually, yeah. I was thinking, why did you kind of decide to go B2B hotels versus B2C, kind of like sommeliers, people that are most interested in wine? Why was that your decision?
It's a great question. Some of it is just sort of, as we understood our market better, it felt like it made sense. So I went back when I started the business and I looked at 2 companies to try to understand what they did. And those 2 companies were Nespresso and Keurig. And I ended up becoming friends with the CEO of Keurig and spent time with him to ask that exact question, like, do you build a hotel business first or a consumer business first, and why? And what's interesting is if you go back and look at both of their histories, and I didn't know this until I studied it, both of them tried to sell the consumer first. We widely rejected it. They retrenched, went and sold to offices and hotels, had success, and then consumers figured out the product was better and bought it for their house. So Plum is a very experiential product. It's hard to understand why it's worth $2,000 until you felt it and had it in your house. And the moment that you get, like, I'll get home tonight and I'll hit a button and be able to have a glass of wine and lay down on the couch and relax. And that feeling of sort of having better nights and enabling great experiences is hard to feel until you felt it. And so I think in experiential businesses, there's a really hard barrier trying to convince consumers to pay for something they've never felt and touched. And hotel rooms, in my mind, are the greatest experiential opportunity in the world. You have a captive audience who's stuck in the room all night, and you have a chance to tell a story. And to the extent you can make that story super compelling, I think you have a chance to do something really great. So I feel like, in general, hotels are one of the most untapped opportunities for experiential products to tell their story. And so that's why we did it. So we'll sell to both, but we love the idea of somebody walking into Four Seasons, feeling Plum, and then buying it for their house.
It's almost like looking at a hotel as if it were like a test lab, basically. So you go into a little cube and test something out and you go home after that.
And I think almost every tech company, Amazon just announced, I was reading earlier today, announced Alexa for hotels. So for everyone in the country who sort of hasn't yet felt how cool it is having an Echo in your house, sort of privacy concerns aside, like it's an amazing piece of tech, and it makes so much sense for the hotel room. Because, by the way, there's nothing more annoying than walking into a hotel room and trying to figure out how to interact with this new thermostat, new alarm clock, new TV, new everything, right? And so why shouldn't that be voice and simple? And I think Amazon will figure that out and get it right.
So it's like a product as a true out-of-home advertising marketing play. You have a question right now?
Going back to the issues of Miami in general as call it a startup ecosystem, relatively new. Regarding temperament of up-and-coming entrepreneurs, I'm an angel, I invest in a few companies, and I've encountered already the fact that anybody from Miami knows better almost. And it took only one of my investors, one of my investments, to actually come back from an accelerator program outside in London to actually hear the maturity of him saying, I need to get a professional CEO to actually run that part of the business so I can focus on the technical part, which is my forte. How do you instill that in a new ecosystem, let's say, where, as you pointed out, I'm actually a lecturer at the University of Miami Business School as well, and I counter that, call it bravado, if you will, of these new people that are coming into an entrepreneurship venture and they think they know everything because they're experts in their field.
Yeah.
And yet, the real world is that we all need to specialize in something and complement our skill sets with other people that maybe have a little bit more seasoned wisdom, that's called. So my question to you is, how do you put that into place as an advice? Because I'm on the board as well at the University of Miami Business School, and I'm aiming to tell them, this is how you do it. But everybody's sort of saying, well, it's Miami, so we're going to get there eventually, like you said, another generation.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, I've sort of encountered an incredible amount of sort of oddly placed optimism. I think I don't have any kids, so this is not a good analogy for me to use, but I'll use it anyway. I don't think it's any different from having a 14-year-old boy, right? There's sort of a point in your life and a maturity where you just sort of believe you have all the answers, you sort of believe you're invincible, you believe you're right, and our ecosystem is at that point, right? And I think the reason Silicon Valley is humbling is, I was just telling to someone before we started, I came here and people were like, you sold the company for $100 million, it's amazing. In Silicon Valley, I have 10 friends who have sold companies for 10 times that. I'm like a starter exit, right? Like, so when everyone around you has sort of done something more, it's really hard to be arrogant, and it's hard to sort of believe that you're the best. And I think there's nothing like, I think long term, that problem will solve itself, because those people will find themselves out of business if they don't learn, or they'll find themselves right and sort of deserving of all the arrogance they have. It's going to cut one direction or the other, but I think that problem will take care of itself when these startups start to blow up because they weren't right.
Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned is in the ecosystem, right? You have to have world-class software engineers. But, like if I'm in New York City and I'm sitting at Google, why would I go to a startup from like a sure path? Like what would make, like as an entrepreneur, how can we convince some of the top talent to take a risk with us? And like how would you recommend compensating them, especially if, you're kind of low on cash and you have to sell whatever?
It's a great question. First of all, it's really actually easy. But almost our entire software team comes out of Google or Amazon's Lab 126, which is the team that built Kindle and Kindle Fire. It's not hard to hire out of Google, because every single person at Google, especially the ones that were there early, understood what it was like to be at early Google. And everybody I know in the Valley, everyone in startups, right? No one yearns to be employee number 34,000. Everyone wants startup Google, right? And I think it comes down to one simple thing: convince people that you're the next Google. I think every single great entrepreneur, and I think this is true for every great engineer, wants to do something that's amazing. I think all of us do, right? You don't get into startups because you just want to be mediocre. You get into it because you want to make real money, you want to do something impressive, and you want to move the needle. And I think, it's very easy to recruit with that story. And my simplest advice on how to recruit for comp: underpay. And that may sound counterintuitive, but if you're matching Google salaries, you've got a shitty value prop. Because the whole reason they should be there is equity. And if they don't believe in your equity, then you really don't want them there, because they're not betting on the business. And so if they believe in your equity, then your job is worth way more than Google is. And if they don't, your job isn't, you shouldn't match the pay. Yeah.
Actually, I'll let you get
Sorry.
Nancy.
2 questions. How far back does your passion for wine go? And the second question is, who's your competition and how are you going to slay it?
Great questions.
Journalist, by the way.
And a Twitter friend.
Okay.
So Well, so I probably shouldn't say this on camera, but I'll say it anyway. I think the statute of limitations is long expired. I got into wine when I was 17. I was growing this business, and I was doing business with Asia and the Pacific Rim. And I was meeting with CEOs and executives out of Asia. And the greatest fear in life I had was these guys were going to figure out I was a high school student. And luckily I was 6'4", and I wore a suit and tie to every single meeting. I was the only kid in high school with a suit and tie on because I would leave in the middle of the day to go to business meetings. And so, you know, I was running around, and I figured out this trick, and the trick was this. This is not advice for anyone, just in case. As soon as we sat down to dinner, I would immediately call the sommelier over. As we were sitting down, I'd say, by the way, can you bring the somm over? I'm a really big wine fan. And as the somm would walk over, immediately I'd sit down with him and say, you know, I really love the work Susana Balbo's doing with the Torontis and the Salto Plateau in Argentina, so I'll just take a bottle of that. And he's like, we don't have that on the wine list. I've never even heard of that. I was like, no problem. You know, I'm an enormous fan of Domus Aurea in the hills outside of Valparaiso in Chile, so I'll just do a bottle of that instead, if you don't have that. And he'd say, well, you know, we don't have that either. Then I'd pick an obscure third wine, and then finally I'd go, you know, you don't have anything I like. Why don't you just bring whatever you like? And for 4 years, that's how I did every business meeting, and I never got ID'd. I think they sort of wondered, but they never ID'd me. So it started really out of necessity. And then I started collecting. I became a judge for wine competitions, and then after I sold my last company, I had the chance to buy a little vineyard and a home in Napa Valley, and so that's where I got sort of really into it. How do we beat our competition? Our competition isn't really direct competition. There are sort of two sides to it. There are these huge, you've probably all seen them, these huge commercial products that you see in wine bars and airport lounges where they say they preserve the wine. And I bought one of those for $10,000. I put it in my Napa Valley house. I was so excited by it that I never thought to validate whether or not it worked. So I loaded it with 8 super expensive bottles of wine on a Thursday. Or I think it was on a Tuesday. And I came back Thursday with a bunch of friends, and all 8 bottles had gone bad. And it was $3,000 in wine down the drain. And I was so livid and so embarrassed that I ended up selling it on Craigslist out of annoyance, and I ended up building the competitor to it. And the reason it doesn't work, it turns out, is that very simply, the step one is pull the cork out of the bottle. And the moment you pull the cork out of a bottle, 2 things happen scientifically. Sulfur dioxide goes out in the atmosphere, and oxygen dissolves into the wine. And once those 2 things happen, you can't preserve the wine. There's no way to sort of reverse pregnancy. It's a one-way process, right? And so you're done, and the wine is gone. And so that's the one solution, and we just think that solution sucks. And then the other one is actually quite a good product, but it's very different. It's a mechanical device called Coravin. It's a little needle that it works. It pushes it through the cork, and then it sort of dribbles the wine out. But it's designed for a different use case. It's designed for the collector that wants to take a 1-ounce taste of an 82 Mouton and put it back in their cellar. And that's sort of the antithesis of what I wanted to build. I wanted to build a device that was the get home from work, it's 9:30 at night, hit the button and relax, catch up on email. And so our device was sort of a very different style product.
Yeah, we have a question.
Yeah.
You certainly in a different category having proven yourself. But when you go into an initial situation where you are looking for investors, how do you approach, or if you were starting over, what advice would you give to somebody that is actually starting in the process, and how do you go about protecting your valuation?
So there's 2 questions hidden in there. I think they're both important. So let's separate them out. So the first question is, how do you find investors? And then the second is, how do you protect your valuation? To the first question, I think you need to find investors that care about what you're doing and complement it. And I think that is way more important than how big a check they'll write. And so, for example, the new investors you mentioned, Las Olas VC, they brought us into Virgin Hotels, and they brought us into, we just got introduced into some folks in timeshare. So having investors that can actually help grow the business is really useful. If we ever are fortunate enough to build a public company, having a guy on our board who's built one is incredibly valuable. So I think finding people, we also went to wineries, and we actually took money from a few wineries. We didn't care what check size they wrote. They could have said, we'll give you $1,000, and I probably would have said okay. Because I wanted somebody who understood how a winery works to actually be interested in what we were doing. And then for us, because we're a highly technical product, I wanted the smartest technical people I could find to be involved, right? And to give me confidence that I was on the right track technically. So the guy who ran engineering at VMware is on our board. We are also in hotels, so the president of Hilton is on our board. So finding folks that sort of care about your mission and can help, I think is way more important than how big a check they cut. I think if you get those people, the rest of the money actually gets a lot easier to raise. I think most people go the wrong order. They try to find a VC who doesn't care about their business and then try to fill in the round. And I think the opposite's better. I think find the people that actually care about what you do and they'll help you get to the real money. The other question is, I think the worst thing in the world you can do is protect your valuation. So a little backstory. When I sold Mykonos, I raised my Series A at a $10 million pre, a $14 million post-money valuation, and we sold it 33 days later for $100 million. So I don't think anyone in their right mind would argue that I protected our investors' valuation. What I did was I was worried that the buyers would realize that we needed cash and would wait us out. And if they waited us out, that valuation would have gone from 100 to 10 instantly. So I needed the cash as a backstop. So I raised that round to basically say to the investors, I don't need you, or say to the buyer, I don't need you, and if you delay, I'm going to go raise again and make it even more expensive for you, right? And so that was the threat. In Plum, I raised our first round at a $20 million valuation off a napkin, so super high. This round, we actually tried to manage the price to not go above a certain number. And we did it for a strategic reason. But I think I don't think you should try to protect valuation. You are better off as a first-time entrepreneur, if it's your first exit, the first exit will give you the credibility to do whatever the hell you want afterwards. You can go build a wine business or whatever is interesting to you. And so I think it's way more important you get to your finish line than it is how much percentage you own. So this time, at this stage in the company, I own a lot more of Plum than I did of Mykonos at the same stage. But the first time I was solving for putting a win on the board, and the second time I'm solving for maximizing value, right? And so I think don't solve for valuation. The weirdest thing to me is I get all these guys in Miami that come to me and say, I just came up with this idea and it's worth $6 million, do you want to cut a check? Why is that the right starting point? The right starting point is like, you care about wine, this is wine related, or you care about cybersecurity, this is cybersecurity related, here's why I think you can help as an investor. If you walk down, we have now probably 30 people invested in our round, and if you gave me the list, I could probably point to what value each person can add, or at least what value I wanted them to add, or thought they would add when I did it. We didn't take a single dollar from someone who couldn't add value. So to me, that is way more important than valuation. I would ignore valuation. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question here.
Yes, my name is Michelle, and I used to live here, but now I work in London. And I shared what you said about entitlement when companies come from the US, especially from this area, and want to expand internationally. They think they know it all. They make a mistake, and they're willing to.
I kind of want everyone to hear you. You're very soft-spoken.
Sorry. So I'm starting again.
Put your mic closer.
My name is Michelle, and I live and work in London, and I'm an advisor to small businesses that want to expand internationally. And what I notice is that companies that come, especially from this area here in Miami, and they're expanding internationally, and they go to places like London, where immediately they think that because it's a speak English country, they can't just replicate what's happening here. And we know that often that's a mistake, and people don't failing. So I just want to know from you, especially the fact that you have done international other businesses instead of other ventures, what is your view on it, and what's your advice, and what do you see the trends of the Miami companies going besides the most obvious areas, which is Latin America or Mexico, just and Caribbean because of geographies. So two questions. Trends and your advice.
Well, that's one of those problems that actually I think is not unique to Miami. I think Silicon Valley is as guilty as anybody. It's sort of having this intense arrogance that something that worked here will scale. And you can see it, right? Even companies that have done amazing things like Uber have sort of stumbled hard when they got to China, when they got to India, when they got to other parts of the world. Facebook sort of notoriously stumbled. Google notoriously stumbled. I don't know a US tech company that has gracefully landed in other parts of the world and got sort of recognized as the heroes they thought they were. I think that's a very common problem for businesses they scale. I think Miami is not unique in that area. I think that bravado that has in Miami is just as bad in Silicon Valley, if not worse, because in Miami they've sort of had the side effect of massive success. So in Silicon Valley.
Yes.
So when you've built Google in the US, you sort of believe, of course you can build Google in China. And they're finding out that that's not true. So I think largely that's a worldwide problem. As for what to do about it, I think that's one of those, you bruise yourself pretty quickly, and I think you tend to learn. Almost all of those companies have sort of stumbled pretty hard. I think most entrepreneurs sort of have some level of awareness now about just because it looks like the U.S. right at a language level doesn't mean it is. Canada's hard to expand into. Going to UK, let alone going to other parts of the world, is incredibly challenging. I think you learn one step at a time. I say that, by the way, we're actually considering expanding worldwide. Listen to what I say, not what I do. But I may be back here next year telling you about why that was a horrible choice. But I think you have to sort of try, right? The weird thing that exists now that didn't exist when I got into business is the sheer replication that can happen in other countries, right? So if you think about Uber, right? Uber was a US starting point, but Didi built arguably a better Uber for China than Uber did. And I think Grab arguably in their portion of the world, and Ola in another. So I think the challenge is, and now I just invested in a company, I found out actually randomly from some guys in the room that had cut a check into a startup that's doing really well, building an Amazon in South America. And it's not Amazon, right? And so I think there are all these companies in each market that have figured out how to replicate a US success before they did. And that's why people have to. So the problem is I feel like you almost have no choice. You sort of have to run first into that wall, knowing that you're probably going to fail, but knowing that you can't just yield a market as large as China. And so I feel like there's a catch-22 for every startup. We worry about that every day. We manufacture in Asia, and it terrifies us that someone becomes the plum of China before we become the plum of China. And so I don't know how to solve for that.
Well, I know you've already asked questions. I'll give someone else the floor back.
Do you see some expansion, whether it's possibly the Plum as a white label of a brand to some of the hotels, or maybe even owning a winery where you guys actually produce your own wine and feed it into your distribution system?
So we've done deals with almost every major luxury hotel and upper upscale hotel chain. So we are in hotels. So we're in Four Seasons, we're in Rosewood, we're in Hyatt, Hilton, Waldorf Astoria, St. Regis, a lot of others. So we love the hotel market. I think, like I said, I think it's an amazing market. I don't think we'll ever become a winery. Part of that is there's a regulatory problem. So when you're dealing in the world of alcohol, buying a winery would make us a manufacturer of alcohol, and a manufacturer cannot supply equipment to a retailer of alcohol, which is what a hotel is. And so there's actually sort of a crazy, and in my view, sort of insanely silly regulatory framework that exists from the repeal of prohibition that still sort of affects everybody today. And I think anyone in this room who's ever tried to own a liquor license can tell you how incredibly painful it is, and in large part for no reason whatsoever, right? And there are great things that alcohol laws should prevent, and they don't seem to do a good job of preventing any of them. There's enormous number of deaths. I helped fund a thing in Napa Valley to build what's called Napa Valley Vine Trail, and it's this biking and walking path on the side of the road because people go to Napa, they drive themselves up for the day, they go drinking at wineries all day, and then they drive back, and every year they kill a whole bunch of pedestrians and bicyclists. And so, one thing that we started looking at Plum is let's start figuring out how to automate some of the problems of alcohol issues before they get there. So we can actually electronically lock the device at 2 o'clock in the morning if we wanted to. we could lock consumption after X glasses of wine. And so, I think there is an important side to responsible drinking, but in terms of the regulatory side, that would probably stop us from ever trying to become a winery. Does that answer your question? Okay.
I'll take a whole question. Go ahead.
So I've got a little bit of a non-tech question, more of an international business.
Well, you don't get a question. Sorry about that. Tech question. Go for it.
You were talking about expansion, and I was curious, how would your mind frame go towards into countries that have I would say, older culture than ours in wine drinking, like Argentina, Chile, France, Italy? How would you tackle that issue to sort of re-educate a population on how you are now introducing the preservation of these wines and how to drink it when they already have a culture that has expanded even longer than even our own history?
It's an awesome question. I think the short answer is I won't. Because I think trying to convince someone to sort of behave differently at a sort of a very philosophical level is really hard to do and sort of way more expensive than a startup can afford to do. That said, I don't think it matters. So here's the interesting thing. If you go back 30 years ago, if you lived in France, the only reason you drank a glass of wine ever was a glass of wine at dinner with your family. There is no wine without food in France in the 1980s, 90s mostly. How many of you have a glass of wine without food? Okay, so almost everybody. So a few liars, but almost everybody else said yes. So the interesting thing is the number one reason people now drink in the US is a glass of wine to relax without food. So wine has fundamentally disconnected from food as the reason people drink. That's now happening in Asia. That's now happening in Europe too. So I actually think this problem is a generational problem. It'll take care of itself. I don't think we'll be the ones to solve it.
So, David, thanks so much for your time. And lastly, I want to ask you this question. What does the world need now?
Honestly, compassion is probably the thing that bothers me. It's, I'm not particularly political, and being in a business where our demographics are all over the place, like I sort of can't afford to be political. But I think it's sort of incredibly hard, especially, one thing I love most about Miami is it's a city of immigrants. And I sort of relate to that. And it's really, really frustrating just to see sort of how harsh our politics have become sort of among the people that we most want in the country. And, as a tech person, sort of even incredibly selfishly, even if you don't give a shit about, the compassionate side of it, and you just look at the economics of it suggests that almost every great company in the last 50 years was built by immigrants. And so I don't love the idea of living in a country that doesn't want the next Sergey Brin to be here. I think that's a huge mistake.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time.